Steve mentioned it. James mentioned a little bit. Now we're going to bring Tony Turner on, and now we're going to look at third party and vendor assessments because, there's a lot of questions we have to ask as well. And Tony's going to be the man for us. Tony, take it away.
All right, thanks for that. Let's get right into it. I'm sure we're towards the tail end of what has been an awesome event, and I just want to make sure that we can get through this and let folks go as we get into this. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the process of doing vendor risk assessments, and specifically some concerns around what does this mean for healthcare and what is different about healthcare. And we're going to get into some specific scenarios that allow us kind of an opportunity to discuss some of the challenges we ran into through the pandemic and COVID vaccines and some of the contract manufacturer organization issues there. All right. So first, we're just going to go over basic overview of like, what are we talking about here? Why is it important to you? Like, kind of how are we doing this in the industry today? I think we have a lot of opportunities to improve this process. And we're going to get into kind of a new approach. It's not necessarily a new approach, but I would say some of the more mature organizations that have been doing vendor risk assessment for a while have kind of learned over time that this is how to tackle the challenge. But I still see a lot of people adopting kind of a legacy mindset in their vendor risk assessment journey. And I'm the course author for Seg 547, which is a brand new course on defending product supply chains. A lot of the content that we're going to cover today is related to this, but we did want to get into some more healthcare specifics around this. I won't belabor the point. Pretty typical about me. If you want to find me, LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to find me. All right. So when it really comes down to it, the primary focus of anything that we do in risk management is about the mission of the organization. And the primary mission of a healthcare organization is patient safety. There's a lot of things that come into play that can complicate that mission. We have a tendency to focus on some of the more traditional cybersecurity risks, but the reality is there's a lot when we get into like some of our contractor dependencies and some of the other things that can create implications for quality and safety inside the organization that can then lead to challenges that we need to address. And it's not always a direct linkage that we can put our finger on. It's not always a direct thing that we can say, well, we need EDR on this machine and that will, you know, satisfy the constraints of our mission. A lot of times, and this is why supply chain is such a challenging topic, is we have so many external dependencies that we have very little control over. A lot of times we only have that kind of initial third party relationship. We can manage that through a contracting relationship, but there's still a lot of that that's kind of outside of our locus of control here. And so it's important that we first understand, like, what is it that we are doing as an organization? Let's look at all our dependencies. Let's break all that down and say, what are the things that's going to cause us to have a challenge and delivering quality care for our patients and ensuring patient safety. Okay. So what I want to drive in on an example that we saw play out during the pandemic, this whole concept of contract manufacturing organizations. And one of the challenges that Pfizer had when they were trying to bring their vaccine to market was just the scale of having to get billions of vaccines out across the globe very, very quickly. Far exceeded their capabilities from a manufacturing standpoint to get this stuff out there. So they had to draw on this whole concept of a CMO or a contract manufacturing organization. And there were, hundreds of these CMOs and various different markets that they had to draw upon to facilitate all this. But how do you ensure quality control when you don't have direct control over how your contract manufacturers are delivering the work product? Now, we can take kind of a traditional vendor risk management process, send them a survey and say, okay, you're doing all the right things. And we can try to lock some of these requirements in the contracts. But when we have things like product security, Dean was talking earlier today about some of the ICS implications in pharmaceutical manufacturing process. Like, how do you get your hands around all of those controls? And when we think about the kind of traditional vendor risk assessment, I'm going to send you a survey, you're going to fill it out and send it back to me. How high assurance is that when what we have is a very critical capability in the delivery of these vaccines to the target market. So we need to kind of think outside the box a little bit and say, is our current risk assessment process, is it doing what we need it to do? Maybe it works in certain circumstances, but we have to look at the specific risks that we're trying to manage and determine if we are checking if we're actually meeting the needs of that particular risk we're trying to manage. So, big picture, when I think about vendor risk and managing vendor risk, I think of it as kind of a trade-off of friction. I need to manage friction. And what I mean by that is engaging in a risk assessment process will create friction in your relationship with your vendors, right? Now, you want to reduce that friction enough so that you're not wasting time on assessments, that you're not needless activities, right? We and part of the challenge that we have when we go through this assessment process is just getting vendors to cooperate in the first place. I think, trust me, they do not want to fill out that survey that you're sending to them because they filled it out probably 50, 100 other times for other customers. It might be the same survey, it might be different, but regardless, there's a cost associated with that that they're just not comfortable with. But at the same time that you're trying to make that piece of the process easier, you're trying to actually increase friction in the sale itself. Because what you really want to have occur here is you need an advocate inside the supplier that's going to bat for you and says, okay, these are my security requirements. These are the things I need to have happen. How do I accomplish this? A lot of times, the salesperson that you are engaging with is your best ally because they are incentivized to close the sale. So, if you can increase friction enough so that the sale is held up by them meeting your requirements at the same time that you're making it easy enough so that it's hard for them to push back on things, that's kind of the sweet spot, right? That's where we want to be. We want to manage that friction throughout the process. Okay? As I alluded to, we have this whole concept of a span of control inside the supply chain, right? The chances are you can only influence the direct contractual relationships you have. We refer to those as third parties. You may have heard the term third party risk management. It's really what we're talking about. We're talking about an external entity that we're engaging with, that we have some sort of contractual relationship where we can hold them accountable for what they're doing and what they're delivering to us. Now, more often than not, the fourth and nth tier parties, those parties that are outside of that span of control, we have little direct influence over. We have to rely on those third party relationships. Now we can push on them and we can say, okay, you are responsible for this and everything that you deliver. I don't care if it comes from a fourth party, nth party, how far up the supply chain, you are accountable for what you delivered to me. But by the way, part of our expectations are that you have your own third party risk management program and it would behoove you to push that upstream, right? Can't directly influence the fourth party, but maybe you can as a third party. Now, when we think about like pharmaceutical manufacturing, we think about kind of like that chain of relationships. If you're the health delivery organization all the way down here at the bottom on the right hand side, you've got 6 or 7 tiers at a minimum that you may have to go upstream. And that's why we use this concept of an nth party, because we would be at like eighth, ninth, 10th, and in some instances, we may be at 100th party or more before we get to like the complexity of what our supply chain looks like. So as an HDO, you may just have your pharmacy relationship, or maybe if you have your own internal pharmacy, maybe you're dealing with a distributor or some sort of other logistics function or supplier. But it's quite possible that you do not have a direct relationship with the pharmaceutical supplier or the CMOs themselves, right? So if the CMO is not delivering a quality product as an HDO, what do you do about that? There's really very little that you can do about that directly. So you have to lean on those relationships to provide you the ability to influence what is ultimately delivered, right? What it comes down to is the contract is probably your single best vehicle to drive positive change. This is where we want to define our security requirements, our expectations with that relationship. Once the contract is signed and we move on, it's going to be really hard to come in after the fact, after the sales is closed and after the contract is in place how do you get additional support from that supplier? It's going to be very challenging, especially if there's a resource cost, some sort of cost associated with implementing additional controls, additional security requirements. So you have to start this process relatively early, right? And that means that you probably are going to need to engage with the areas of your business that are driving the buyer process, right? Those pieces of the business that may not be a cybersecurity driven function. It may not be even a procurement driven function, maybe earlier in that process. Or we need to understand what those requirements are. What is this thing that you're going to buy? What is it going to do? So that we can get all those requirements into the contract. It'd be helpful to be able to start that conversation, even verbally, with your supplier before you get into the actual contracting process, so there's no surprises. One of the biggest challenges that I see in just executing a program like this is speed, right? It takes a long time to move through this process. And the more gates you insert into the process, the longer your assessment process takes, the more likely that your organization is just going to accept the risk and move on because they can't be held up by your supply chain risk management process. You're getting in the way of them doing business. You're getting in the way of them doing what they need to do. And if your supply chain risk assessment process is slowing things down to the point where it impacts patient care, you have a really big problem, right? We have to figure out, how do we streamline this? How do we make this faster? Right. So when we get into like, how do we actually do this today? Right. And we typically have this kind of traditional vendor risk assessment process. You send out a bunch of surveys, it's kind of have some challenges with context. What we try to do is we try to make them all the same because it makes our reporting easier, right? You just send everyone the same assessment, and you want to measure risk posture across your portfolios. It's easier when you have consistency in your process. The challenge is we're sending a lot more information. We're asking for a lot more information than we really need. And a lot of times, because we're having to do this at scale with a large amount of requests, a large amount of data, a large amount of processing of that information, it means we never really get the time to spend on it to really think about, is this the right batch of questions? Or are we executing this in a way that makes sense? And are you sending suppliers questions that are very clearly not applicable, right? Like, what are the examples I frequently use? Is like your lawn maintenance company. If you're sending a cloud security alliance set of questions on their cloud security posture to your lawn maintenance provider, why? It's part of your process. It's what you do. You send the same questions to everybody, but it's very, very wasteful activity. Like, so let's think about better ways to do this and more adaptive approaches to do this. So kind of traditional timeline of an assessment, and your process may be shorter or longer than this. This is about a 7-month process that I've laid out, but your process may vary. But kind of traditionally, you have some sort of intake process. We say, okay, we're going to queue up an assessment. Maybe it takes a day, maybe it takes a month, whatever. We send them a survey, right? And then we spend a bunch of time just chasing the vendor. Like, if you look at this timeline, the vast majority of our time is just spent in follow up with the vendor. It's not actually engaging in the assessment. It's just trying to get cooperation from them, just getting a response out of them. Well, it's a very wasteful amount of time. If we're asking them for things that they don't really need to answer, and we're creating assessment total here, and we're spending a bunch of cycles. Meanwhile, the organization is waiting for this assessment to be completed so that you can sign off on the procurement. This isn't helpful, right? And then once we do get a response, who is the group that's doing this work? Do you have the linkages with your security operations and security architecture teams? Are there technical people on the team that are doing these assessments? Or it's just checkbox exercise? Hey, they gave us a response. We're good. Throw the thing up on SharePoint, moving on with their lives, right? And that's what I see a lot of organizations wind up doing. They're doing lots of assessments, but they're not generating any value. They're not buying down any risk in their process. They're not doing any technical validation. They're not doing any evaluation of that evidence that comes back. You may not even be asking for evidence. You may be asking yes, no questions and not getting any kind of clarity at all and what they're actually doing to meet your security requirements. And by and large, I see an awful lot of organizations that don't even have a remediation process associated with their assessments. They did the assessments and meets the policy requirements, or if they have external compliance requirements to do this kind of work, checks the box, but they're not actually buying down any risk at all with this process. However, they're spending an awful lot of money on doing assessments. This kind of process is not scalable, and it does not result in very effective risk reduction. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do assessments this way. In certain circumstances, it makes a lot of sense. If you have high risk vendors that you need to have a lot of focus and effort and go through and do evidence validation and all these things, that makes a ton of sense. But to do this on your low risk vendors and all your vendor population and kind of take this one size fits none approach to your assessment, their assessment process, it's probably not the most effective strategy in the world. Okay. So we send these questionnaires. Typically, it's some kind of spreadsheet or an online portal. And again, like, we're sending them this information, we're asking them for a lot of data. And one of the things that is very interesting to me that a lot of people don't think about is you are creating third party risk for the supplier that you were asking this information. You are now a custodian of sensitive data, depending on what you've asked. How deep do you go into the details? Is it necessary? Do you really need to hold on to all that risk information for your supplier? You may not need to. That's part of the reason why they're going to be resistant. It's not just a work effort. It's also, they don't necessarily want to share that information with you either, because that's their sensitive data and they're letting keys of their kingdom out the front door just to engage in this procurement for you. Okay. There's a bunch of different kinds of assessment questionnaires. I would say the most common is probably the SIG or the SIG-like. The SIG is over 1,200 questions. This is a massive, massive survey. Even if you do the SIG-Lite, it's still 200 questions. So Joe's Lawn Service, what 200 questions are important for Joe to answer? Are there 200 questions that are important for Joe to answer? Maybe there's only 10 or 20. Maybe there's only a handful of questions, right? So we want to think about, like, how can we, again, take an adaptive approach, an adaptive risk-based approach to determine what kinds of questions we're asking and what kinds of assessment approaches we're taking. Maybe a questionnaire isn't the right approach, right? Now, there's a bunch of companies out there that do this work. ServiceNow, Process Unity, the HISAC questionnaires executed via Prevalent. Fortress, I used to run R&D at Fortress, so been kind of deep in the space for a while, executing these processes. And then we're starting to see this advent of AI being a model to kind of scale this process. Great, I need to process 500 inbound questionnaires. Can I use AI to do that? It's interesting. It's definitely an interesting approach, and it can certainly help us with scalability. But the question that occurs to me is it just helping us take a low value activity and do it faster? Are we automating failure? Or are we actually getting more effective in our assessment process by using AI and these tools? Kind of an open question. I don't have a clear answer for you here. You kind of have to answer that for yourself. But it's certainly a question you should ask yourself as you're going through this. Am I just automating the current process? And is my current process actually working? Okay. So when I think about that 200 question survey, does that address the unique risk of those CMOs? Is that even going to answer the challenge that I have here? If my process here, the risk that I'm trying to manage here is a vaccine quality issue as it relates to how the CMOs are then supporting the supply chain for the vaccine manufacturer, like, what about this process is actually supporting that risk, right? How much of that survey, how much of that assessment process is actually helping us here? As we think through this, foremost in our mind, anything we do in risk management, it all comes back to the core mission of the organization, patient safety. What am I doing as it relates to risk management, and how does it contribute to improvements to patient safety? Every step of the way, this is the question you should be asking yourself. And if you don't have a clear understanding of this, I would challenge you to spend a little bit more time and think about, am I working on the most important things? Does my process actually support the risk management requirements, the risk management needs of the organization? Got it. So what's a better way to do this? Okay. So again, it's all driven based off of your procurement process. This is a business centric, this is a business centric process. This is not a cyber centric process. If you are trying to, if you're trying to in-house 100% of this work, you will be drowning in effort and you will not get it done. Now, maybe you can outsource it to a third party provider, managed services, big four firm, whoever, and that will help you with some scalability. But even when you do that, even if someone else is doing the assessments, ultimately it's your risk. You have to make the risk determination. Even if Deloitte or whoever is doing thousands of assessments for you, are you delegating risk management decisions to them? I sure hope not. That's still your decision. That's still your risk that you need to make. So the better you can get at embedding this process into the organization, simplifying the process and delegating a lot of the upstream activities, a lot of the intake processes, and understanding where can we kind of bifurcate our process and determine where is intelligent vendor risk management, intelligent vendor risk assessments, whether it's a survey or whether it's just using some sort of OSINT vendor scoring capability, or whether it's accepting an attestation, right? These are all perfectly acceptable approaches as long as you understand the pros and cons of the different approaches and what it means for your particular procurement and your particular vendor. But enroll the organization in your process. Delegate some of the upfront intake and triaging of this work. So when I think about this risk triaging funnel, so the scenario is this: I have 100,000 vendors. I can only assess 500 this year. Which 500 do I assess this year? How do I get to that understanding? Now, see, a lot of people have this kind of intake process, and their intake process itself is kind of heavy handed. I was working with a critical infrastructure organization a few weeks ago, and they said that they had 50 questions in their intake questionnaire. How is that really helping you scale this process? What we really want to get to is we want to get to buckets of risk and vendor cohorts so that we can start to determine low, medium, high vendor type. This is what my process is going to look like based off of this bucket, right? And so there's a simple 5-question survey that I've used as a starting point. Now, these may not be the right questions for you, and it may not necessarily be the right questions for a lot of people, but it's certainly a starting point as you start to think through the questions you need to ask. Do you have my data? Do you have logical access, physical access? You're offshore, you're in the cloud, right? This is a nice starting point. I like to stay under 10 questions, preferably in the 3 to 5 question range, because all I'm trying to do is create a quick and dirty understanding of the inherent risk, the risk potential of this vendor. What could they mean? I'm not evaluating controls here. Like, this has nothing to do with controls. This just has understanding, how bad could it be? What are the potential consequences of dealing with this vendor? Okay. Once we kind of understand that, we kind of look at our vendor cohorts within healthcare. Maybe it's medical supplies, maybe it's contract medical staff, maybe it's, waste management, disposal, food and nutrition services, building management. These are all, you're not going to ask someone that's responsible for OT systems and building management and facilities the same question you're not going to be concerned with the same risks that you are your contract medical staff that are there to augment your medical staff, right? Completely different risks. You don't want to be asking them the same questions. So I would caution you to think about, like, what are your buckets? What are the buckets of vendor types that you manage? And how can you put them in the kind of low, medium, high buckets and tailor your risk assessment journey accordingly. What are we trying to accomplish with our assessment? Are we just, is this a general risk posture? Are they doing development for us? So we need to look at their application security and software assurance practices. Are we looking at, at M&A and like kind of offshore and adversarial influence? Are these the kinds of things that we want to manage? Is it compliance or regulatory risk? Maybe we're worried about the privacy of patient data, and that's the risk we want to manage because this vendor has access to our patient data, right? Like all of this, these are the kind of questions you should be asking yourself as you go through this process. And once you have this information, what are you going to do about it? Okay. One alternative that I've seen a lot of people fixate on is this whole concept of an exchange, a data exchange. The idea is you don't need to do the assessment. Somebody else already did the assessment. Just go buy the report. Somebody already did it. CyberGRX is probably one of the most popular and well-known assessment exchanges out there. It does reduce friction in that process, right? The idea is you assess once, share many people can buy it. Part of the challenge, though, is when you go through this process and push someone into an exchange, chances are the evidence is redacted from that process. Because when you go through a risk, think about your own risk assessments. You probably, there's probably a lot of sensitive data about your organization and how it works when you think about how the vendor is directly influencing you and how they're directly working with you and what their controls are. What do they do for you? There's probably a lot of revealing information there. And some of that evidence is not appropriate to share externally. So we wind up with a little bit lower fidelity in our assessment process, but much better scalability, better cost, right? And this it's a bit of a trade-off, right? We also have this whole concept of attestation exchanges. SafeBase is probably the one that I see the most out there. We have other models for sharing attestation data. The big difference between an assessment and an attestation, the way I see it, is when you do an assessment, you're asking the vendor to do the work. Yes, you have some work to do on your end to validate and do some risk acceptance. But from an attestation standpoint, they've already done the work. This is also a really good way to reduce the friction in your assessment process and maybe sufficient. They went and got an ISO certification, or they went and got IEC 61443 product security certifications. I've seen this a lot, especially with the CMOs in the pharma space. That was a lot of the big questions that I saw coming out of pharma. They wanted to make sure the CMOs had good OT security and good product security in place. And so they had good assurances that they were going to have a repeatable process and high quality controls in place for the manufacturing that they were doing. But if you have to think about what are the attestations that I'm going to accept? How do I map those attestations to risk inside my environment? So we put together a vendor risk assessment matrix, and I'll provide a link to this here on the next slide here in a moment. But we looked at different kinds of assessments and kind of high, medium, low, uh, like buckets of risk, right? What are the advantages? Like, what is the data confidence of this assessment type? How does that map to our risk ranking that we do? What is it? How's it map to cost and scalability? And almost more importantly, the participation level. Like for instance, OSINT doesn't require any participation from your vendor until you find something and reach out to them and say, hey, I saw something bad. I need your support to do it. It's it's very low confidence, and you may have a bunch of wrong data in that assessment, but you don't need cooperation, and that's very scalable. Again, we've got a bunch of other assessment types that we can do. We can do the AI-driven assessments. There may be a place for you to do on-site assessments. I've done quite a few of these on-site, especially in the manufacturing space, to evaluate. Sometimes you won't get the real picture just from an assessment that you do a paper assessment, right? Sometimes there's no substitute for an on-site. There's a lot of other reasons why we might need to do assessments. Maybe there's a specific hazard that you're trying to mitigate and address. But at the bottom, you can see this is a link to this cheat sheet if you're interested in obtaining that risk matrix. And then in sum, The important thing here is that we are managing the friction in our process. We have visibility into this. We're all starting from different places in our journey. And so we need to understand where we're at and try not to bite off too much. We take a crawl, walk, run, a maturity model driven approach, and make sure you're using the right tools for the job. Don't just throw the same assessment process at everything and expect that you're going to have a good result. And while tools are part of this, your teams are executing the process. And it's important that you not forget about the people and process, again, even outside of the cybersecurity organization that can facilitate this. It's also important that we think about, like, who are the people on the other side of this? Am I even talking to the right people at the supplier? And as you go through this, think about what works and what doesn't. Maybe AI driven approaches are the best model, or maybe there's some other kind of approach that makes sense for your program. All right. This is my information. Feel free to reach out if you have any follow up questions. If there are any other questions in chat, happy to help. Thanks for joining us.
I loved everything you had to say, Tony. Again, I like the policy stuff. I like talking through the different methodologies and steps. It's what you had to say and how you broke it down just really resonated with me. And I hope it did with others as well.
It has. YouTube feels the same way. Just going through all of it. It's we mentioned it before. GRC is not the shiny, cool thing when people ask about like cybersecurity. But as I said in YouTube, I feel it needs to be up there, like one of the most important parts. Like, it, it definitely needs to be up there. It's important.
Yeah, it's certainly not the entirety of what we cover in the supply chain course. It's really day one. We focus on vendor risk and adversarial influence and overarching supply chain, but it is a much more technical course than just the vendor risk angle. But it is a hard topic to cover holistically and address both the GRC and traditional risk management aspects, as well as the more traditional hardware and software shards based controls and mitigations that are needed here. So thank
Absolutely.
you, Richard.
Did a phenomenal job.